Okay, so you just introduced me, so I can like skip ahead over the first couple of slides. But first of all, thank you to everyone who made it that early, especially of the speakers. It was quite wild yesterday, so I really appreciate everyone who showed up. Alex, actually the only one right now. Make sure you'll get some kind of award or something. So yeah, Jakob did a quick introduction of myself. I'm a usability analyst at ShopDirect, which is a, I'll talk a little bit more about ShopDirect in a second. But that basically means if you were present at Vitaly's talk yesterday, he was talking about UX design. And in my role, I'm focused a bit more on the research part. I have a background in psychology, so that's quite helpful in that kind of role because I know a little bit about like how humans behave, how they think, etc. And also have a bit of a research background, which comes in handy at times. I really like video games. That's why I try to do some user research on games, so play testing, games user research, whenever I have the time for that. And at the moment, I'm staying in the United Kingdom. I live there, but originally I'm from Germany. I also spent some time in the Netherlands and Sweden, and I'm for the second time in Poland now. So this is where I work. Company called ShopDirect Group. Here are some basic facts. They're the UK's biggest home shopping company. They have a couple of different brands. They sell, basically they are an online compartment store. They sell fashion, electricals, beauty items, jewelry, basically everything. And they have a revenue of about like $2.6 billion, of which 80% now is generated online, which is quite remarkable because originally we were a catalog business which has evolved over the course of like 80 years into an online retailer. And it won't surprise you that in the past couple of years the mobile sessions have exploded, and now 40% of all our sessions are mobile, which includes smartphone and tablet, by the way. Oh yeah, and recently we hired Optimus Prime, which is pretty cool, but all he really does is drink a lot of coffee. But let me just get a quick view of the audience. How many of you are actively involved in some kind of startup at the moment? Can I just see a show of hands? Okay, cool. And how many of you would consider themselves investors or VCs, any kind of that? Okay, so a couple of people in both, cool. How many of you have been to Vitaly's talk yesterday? Okay, good. There will be some overlap. I'll try to don't cover the same things as well. How many of you have a firm knowledge of what UX means? Okay, that's fewer than I expected. How many of you practice UX in your business? So how many of you have certain processes that take care of their user experience? 1, 2. And are there any that would consider user experience one of their top 3 priorities of their business? Hey, awesome. Okay, that's a lot. Actually, more than who are doing something about user experience, which is weird. So I'll just give a rough overview about what user experience is and what it not is. So there are a couple of really tempting ways to design. A lot of people design by those because they are tempting. The first one you'll probably be familiar with is designing by committee. So everybody has a vote, and the guys from marketing tell you, hey, I want this button to be green, and then the guys from accounting say, hey, but this text has to be here. And at the end of the day, you have like a horrible website, and nobody's happy, least of all the user. And then you can design by inspiration, and Vitaly made a very good point yesterday by saying that design is not art. So just stay away from the heavy stuff. And also by user request. And that's something that I'll stress a bit more, because obviously you want to listen to your users. That's the whole point of my talk here. Users usually know really well what kind of problems they have and what they don't like. What they not necessarily know is how to solve these problems. So if you listen to users, and again, you should do that, try to get a feeling for where the pain is, where they struggle, where they don't know how to use your stuff. Don't go and ask them, hey, what do you want us to build for you? How do you want us to solve that problem? and then just do that, because you'll end up with horrible stuff. But it's actually what you see a lot of the times if you do a survey for some kind of product. They are like, what are kind of ideas you have, how we could improve, and while you can extract good stuff from that, be really careful about that. So a better way to design that is obviously UX design. I really talked about that yesterday quite a bit, and I really liked his presentation, so make sure if you're interested in this, to look up his slides. In a nutshell, it is design by observing, not by assuming, not by expecting, not by reading about what your users, so not your investors and not somebody else's users, but your users can easily use. So not what they can wrap their head around if you give them some assistance, or what they can do after they read a manual, but what they can easily use. And how do you figure that out? Which is where user research comes into play, so what I do. And what user research is, at the core, is a methodology to figure out how wrong you are in your assumptions about your users. And I say how wrong because you are definitely wrong to some extent. Let me really stress that, because that's the complete point of user experience. You want to figure out who your user is, what they want, what they can use, and then see what you expected and if that matches. And if it doesn't match, you have a problem. This is because you are wrong, because most of you are smarter than the average user. You wouldn't be here if you were not smarter than the average person, probably. The other thing is, you're probably too humble to be aware of that. People have a way of seeing the world as they experience it. So if I look at my father and I see him work on my computer, I'm amazed by how little he knows and how much he struggles. And I'm sure you all have similar experience with people around you. So we are not necessarily aware that other people are experiencing the world in a different way. And also your observations are biased. So if you have your product and you show it to your mother and you show it to some friends, to some customers, chances are that even without noticing it, you are biasing the results. So you might, for example, test people, and then you might, like, when you see them struggle, you're like, oh yeah, you just have to click here, yeah. So you help them a little bit, you nudge them a little bit, you're like, oh, do you like it? Do you like it? Yes. So chances are you don't get neutral observations. And now, in how, or in what way can you be wrong? You can have wrong assumptions about what your users expect, what they don't expect, what they can do, what they can't do, what they want, how they want it, what they perceive, etc. So there's really a lot that you can get wrong, and that's why I'm 100% sure that you will never get all of this right for every customer. So is that a bad thing or not? That's a really important question, because user research will help you figure out basically two major questions, which are, how wrong are you? Because it might be that you are wrong, but you're 99% right maybe, so that would be quite cool. And the other one is, how bad, how severe is that? So it might be that you are wrong, that you assume something that is not correct about your users, about how they use your product. But in the end of the day, that doesn't really matter, because it's just like they confuse one or two steps of the user journey, and it doesn't really matter in your end results. So user research can help you figure out both of these questions. And let me cover both of them, and I'll start with how wrong you are. This is Apple Maps. And it is a really nice example for the amount of wrong. What I like about this picture is that you can clearly see, you can clearly put a number on how wrong this user experience is. If you don't really can see it from there, this is where they say the stadium is, and that's obviously where the stadium really is. And if you translate that to your users and to a product that you want to sell to your users, it is of massive importance that your users are at a point where you expect them to be and not somewhere else, and there's this mismatch between what you expect of them and what the reality is like. So I'll get a bit deeper into that point. This is your user. This is what your user brings to the table when they come and use your service, product, app, whatever. The bottom layer consists of basic human attributes. So everyone should have them to different extents. So this is perception, For example, color perception, 8 of 100 male users are colorblind or have some sort of color deficiency, which is 8%, which is quite a lot. So they might not be able to spot the difference in two buttons if the only difference is the color. Motor skills, aiming, fat finger syndrome on any touch device. So most of the users will share these skills. Most of users who are not severely impaired will have quite a decent level on all of these, but there are differences, and that's important to keep in mind. The second layer is something like general domain knowledge, so tech skills. How much tech and device and internet experience do your users have? So if you do user testing, you will be amazed how many people don't know that a grayed out button means inactive. What I see when I do user testing is people click on grayed out buttons to know and get really frustrated about why it does not work. And also, for example, on clicking on something. We all know that we click on something, and when our internet connection is slow, we look at the little icon that shows if it's loading or not. A lot of people obviously don't know that. So when they click something and nothing is happening, they don't know. Does the button not work? Did I just screw it up? Is there no functionality behind that? So it's really important to keep in mind that all of these are things that not all users know. And the last part is your specific product, your specific website, your specific app, knowledge to that. So when users come to your product for the first time, this layer will be completely blank. People will have expectations based on what you just saw. They will expect that if there's an X someone, that they click on that and it closes. But they will learn that, obviously. And that's one of the reasons why stuff like the iPhone was so super successful in terms of usability. Not because people know it when they first use it, because nobody knew how to use an iPad when you have it in your hand at the first time. It might be that you press something and nothing happens, might be. But you'll learn it really, really quickly because it gives you perfect feedback, it gives you immediate feedback, and to be fair, it's quite consistent with a lot of expectations that you have. So, for example, in Shop Direct, what we do is all our important confirmation buttons, so continue to basket, agree, etc., are green. Just to have this consistency that users learn, because we have a lot of customers, obviously, that come back and they come back and they come back. So it's important for us to make sure to make it easier for them by teaching them conventions. Others can be like video games. All video games have obviously an important set of conventions, the main rules, the main functionality, all that stuff. So this is you. I told you before that's your customer, but that's not completely true. This is you because if you develop a product, this is tailored to you. You know everything about your product because you develop it. You have the skills that you need to use your product because you developed it. And obviously, you would not develop a red and green design if you were colorblind, so chances are you also have all the basic attributes that you need to use it. Your customers will look somehow like this. They will have gaps. They might have gaps that then constitute other gaps in the higher levels. So I gave you the example of a colorblind person, which will not be able, for example, on our website, to distinguish between the green confirm buttons and the blue information buttons. And then it's like you have this avalanche effect where it all goes downhill. And you have customers that are absolutely clueless. I recently had a user test where a startup came to us and they wanted to sell us some technology. So I tested basically the software to make sure our users would be able to use it. And I had a quick run through that. It took me about like a minute to set up an account. That was the task I set myself, set up an account. So I did that. Were like seven or 8 clicks. You had to fill out a couple of form fields and upload a picture. When I gave this to the first user, it took her 35 minutes. 35 minutes to set up an account. And that was not because the tool was obviously horrible to use, but because that user had some really important gaps on this level. So though she said she uses an iPad at home and she said she was confident at using it, she did, for example, not know how to upload a picture with her iPad, and that was a requirement for setting up your account. So she struggled with that, then she closed a tab because she wanted to go back, and all these kind of misconceptions about how the basic technology works led her into like an endless cycle of despair and tears, basically. As a user researcher, it's really important that you let the chaos just unfold and watch it. Because if you have that on video, then it's much easier to convince your designers than if you just say, yeah, this is crap. So if you have this completely clueless customer, can you do anything about that? A lot of times I say that to designers, the answer will be, yeah, okay, but I mean, if they don't know how to use a computer, what am I to do about it? I can just control like this little part of the website. But there are actually a couple of ways that you can do stuff. This is an example where people have tried to help their customers with the download process, because obviously not everyone knows how to download stuff in an operating system like Windows. So they give you some hints. Press Control and J to see the progress. Or, this is my favorite, you can change your default download location in your browser settings. What do you think, how many people know how to navigate and find their browser settings? It took me a couple of seconds to find that out with Google Chrome. So, maybe not the best way. What I like much more is this one. And this is really almost genius. This is just a file hosting website, and once you click download, there's this big green arrow that goes down to your taskbar. Because that's all you, as a user, have to do to get to your files. You don't need to understand the browser, you don't need to understand your file destination. All you need to know is, oh yeah, click here, and then you get your file. So that was pretty amazing. And I encourage all of you to think about ways of how to do that. Okay, so this is basically the first main question about how wrong you are about your assumptions. And it is all about figuring out what you expect your users to be able to do and what they are actually able to do. And the second big question is how big of a problem that actually is. So how bad is that? And I only have 2 slides on that, but it's nevertheless important. So the first one is this interaction of how tech-savvy your users are. So basically, the layer 2 I showed you, how much tech experience do they have? Because if they have a lot of tech experience, no matter how unusable your website is, they will probably figure it out in some way. And the other one is how unique is your proposition? Because if you have something that is unique, that no one else does, then people will probably struggle quite a bit to work their way past an error message or past any kind of bumps that you put in their way. You might argue with the placement of some of these. The iPhone is no longer a unique proposition, but when it was first introduced, it certainly was. But the only really important thing is to have a look out for the top right and the bottom left quadrant. Excuse me. In the bottom right quadrant, you have very tech-savvy users, and you also have a unique product. So chances are that if you have a bad UX, it might not be as bad because your users will probably be able to figure it out. That does not mean that you should be content with a bad UX, because after your early adopters are done with it and they're happy with it, at some point it will reach more average customers probably, and then you'll get into trouble later down the road. More importantly is the bottom left quadrant, because if you're in that, user testing, usability, user experience is crucial. My favorite example is World of Warcraft, because when World of Warcraft was introduced in 2005, I think it was, or 4, MMOs, so massively multiplayer online games, especially role-playing games, were a total niche product. Only hardcore video gamers played it, and if you went to the predecessors like EverQuest, you still had command logs and stuff like that. So it was a horrible UI. And then World of Warcraft came along. And you all know the success story. And suddenly people who had never before touched a video game at all could play the most hardcore niche game. Even though that obviously might not be all that contributes to their success, it's very likely to assume that it is definitely played into their hands. The other thing, and I'll go over this quite quickly, is that obviously you need to tie this to some sort of KPIs if you really want to know how big your problem is. Because you might just say, okay, yeah, the UI, it looks a bit cluttered, but as long as you don't really know what the impact of that is on the metrics that are important to you, then you can't really tell about it. So for example, for us, what is really crucial at ShopDirect, because we're an e-commerce business, is open wallet conversion. Bounce rate, not so much, because we get a lot of customers, a lot of people come to our website. What is really crucial for us is to keep those people who are already have taken their money out, want to pay, and can't, because you make it so hard for them. And the other one, and that's, I think it's equally important for us and for startups, maybe even more for startups, is what probably you might call virality or the K factor or whatever. We call it Net Promoter Score, or we use the Net Promoter Score to measure that, like a couple of big companies do. Usability is highly correlated with the NPS and with other measures of how you recommend stuff. So just decide which KPIs, which metrics are important to you, and then try to relate that. I'll give you a short prime on how you can do that. So for the moment, just assume that you are totally sold on this idea. You think you want to have a great UX, and some people here said it's some of their top priorities, so I take you by that. But you might not necessarily know how to go about this. So there are a lot of different techniques. And I mean, the first and the most important thing is that you always keep in mind that you are wrong in your assumptions. That's always the first step. As soon as you start to think, yeah, okay, I know that, I got that, I know what my customers want, it'll get tough. To get a bit more into detail, these are methods you can use. And you will probably never use a lot of them unless you're Google or Apple or Microsoft Research. I sorted them by resources that are required, and that will probably be a limiter to some of you, and also by what kind of data they give. So if you're not familiar with these terms, qualitative basically means that it tells you something about the why stuff is happening, user opinions, user feedback, interviews, stuff that you cannot count necessarily. And quantitative means you can perform statistical analysis on that. And they both have the pros and cons. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. It also highly depends on what kind of problem you're trying to solve. A lot of times people come to me and say, hey, can we just get some user opinion on this? And I always say, yeah, of course you can. But then I have to go and look at what the real problem is. Because, for example, if you're in an early concept stage, say you have basically figured out what your main problem is, what you want that you're going to solve, what the main functionalities of your tool is, then you can use, for example, this combination of methods. A diary study might be bit much effort, but it's really nice to find out how people deal with the problems that you assume they have in their everyday life, and get a bit more qualitative feedback on that. You can do card sorting to figure out how your navigation should look like. You can do key task analysis, and I will get into some of these methods in a bit more detail soon. You can always do a survey that's nice and easy. If you, however, already have a product, and let's say you have a problem with checkout conversion, then these might be tools you want to use. So for example, first you do some user testing to figure out, to get an idea of what the problem might be. Then you do a click test to see, for example, okay, I presume there might be a problem with a call to action that people don't see or don't click on that. And then you can use different tools to try to approximate and approach this problem. The vertical line in the middle is probably what the average startup will be able to invest in terms of resources, because you can always do a short user testing. You can always do basic click tests. You will probably not want to do eye tracking. This is because obviously your research budget is limited. You might not even have a research budget. So let me just give you a quick overview about tools that you can use with little to no money. In my eyes, one of the most underestimated and the most important ones is the key task analysis. Because you might have, again, your assumptions about what your users want to do, what they can do, etc., but you have to validate that in some way. So just, if your tool only has one task, then that's fine, but then you can still, like Vitaly yesterday said, a good UX design always communicates exactly the functions that it can do. So if people have like 10 tasks they think they can do with your tool, but it only can do one, that's another way of finding out that you have a problem. You don't have to do this with a lot of customers, and one basic rule in usability research is that representativeness is more important than having a high number of customers. So it is much better to test on, if you're targeting like 50-year-old women, then it's much better to test with 10 50-year-old women than it is to test with 120-year-old men. Another one is a cognitive walkthrough. That's the most inexpensive one, but also one that is a bit questionable in terms of what outcomes you get. You need to have the user tasks that I just talked about. So that can be, for example, set up an account, that can be upload a picture of yourself, that can be make a payment, these specific tasks. And then you yourself go through your website or through your app, and you think, okay, now I have to do this, now I do this, now I do this, where might I struggle, what is my user journey, basically. But it's really difficult to simulate that you have the same level of skill, knowledge, experience as your users. Just try for a second to imagine you can't speak English and you don't understand anymore what I'm saying. That's pretty tough, right? So the next one is user testing, and that's probably the one that I do most in my day-to-day job, because you have a quick turnaround. If you have a bit of money and you can invite people rapidly, you have access to a lot of customers, and that's very easy to do. You invite some customers, you set them on these kind of tasks, and then you just note down where do they struggle, where do they have problems. Make sure not to help them too quickly. You know, if you're a nice person, you probably want to help them out. You want to, like, yeah, don't get frustrated. It's hidden down there. But that will, A, not show you a lot of the problems, because if their users are at home, they obviously won't have your help. And also, again, if you do video recordings of that, and you get into debate with your designers, and you tell your designers, hey, users really struggle with this, it's always better to have a video of a customer being like, 30 minutes, I can't find this is horrible, and this happens all the time. Another important point on this is that you actually can get almost all of your biggest issues with only 5 users. So you don't need to have, there are a lot of like assumptions about how many people you need to get something significant statistically, stuff like that. But you can get your biggest problems, the problems that most users will have, with only 5 people. Click test is one of my favorites, and I asked Vitaly yesterday about what he thinks about flat design. Because flat design is making it more and more difficult to communicate to the user where calls to actions are and where not. So 3D buttons, that was quite an easy and understandable thing, but without this illusion of three-dimensionality, okay, that's probably not a word even, it's really hard because your users will click where they can't click, they will not click where they are supposed to click. And what you do about that is you can do that on a really, really easy scale. Just do printouts of your prototypes, of your wireframes, of screenshots if you already have a finished product. Put that on a desk in front of your customers and say, please make a cross on every part of the picture that you think you would be able to click. So a link or a button or whatever. And then you can also very easily quantify that. So you can take the stash of papers, and then you go through that and say, okay, like 7 out of 10 people clicked this text, even though it is not clickable. We might just add a link there. Or the other way around, only 2 out of 10 people clicked this button, even though it is a button. So you might have an idea that the call to action is not working. And if you're like I am in e-commerce, then calls to action are massively important, especially if they are related in some way to your KPIs. Card sorting, quite good for certain tasks. So if you're doing ideation in terms of understanding how people group things in their mind, or to validate if you already have a concrete idea, it's basically putting a lot of cards in front of your customers. That's why it's called card sorting. And what you can do, for example, if you want to get a clue about how to build your navigation, then you can say, okay, we have contacts, we have a shop, we have women's zone, we have a men's zone, etc. You prepare cards for all the items you want to basically build into your navigation, and then you ask your customers just to group them into categories. And you can either do that in a bit more quantitative way with tools like user zoom, which basically calculates for you the average distance between items. It's a bit technical, but the other way is just to have a group of customers do that and just interview them while they're doing it, find out why they think that. And then you see, okay, it might be an issue of how we call this item, or we just expect it to sit somewhere else, or nobody expects it to stay at the same place, then you might even consider putting it at different places. It's a really good way to have a user-centered navigation. And the last one is split testing, and I just mentioned that because can be quite powerful, but you probably will not have the budget to do that early on. It is really good for some things. Because you can just, if you have certain analytics attached to your tool already, then you can just quickly build two variations of the same thing, swap the placement of a button, because that can sometimes be really crucial, and then see what is better. For example, we have an e-commerce website, a quite big one, quite complicated one, so there are a lot of interest, a lot of interrelations. So recently we were thinking about replacing the footer with a new footer. And people came and asked me, like, what is your usability view on this? And I said, honestly, guys, I have no clue, because if you change this button and this color and this, there are so many interrelations between that, it's impossible to predict the outcome. So you just run a split test and then you know. What you don't know is the why. So it's always important, if you do split testing, to accompany it with some kind of qualitative testing. So for example, user research, or for example, just go out and interview people. It's not always easy to get that, and sometimes there are no obvious reasons, but sometimes, and that happened in the past for us, you'll find some really, you might stumble across some really nice nuggets. Okay, so if you have all these methods, how to make the most of them. And there are just a couple of basic rules that I want to touch on that are really important to keep in mind to get the most of your money, basically. So the first one is triangulate. And that means use several tools, don't just use one. Because, for example, if you use web analytics and you use user testing, then you learn more than if you learn more about each than you would without the combination. If you do user testing on a checkout conversion problem, so your analytics say we have a checkout conversion problem, and then you do user testing, then you might find in user testing, okay, part of this problem might be that users don't see a call to action, which is my favorite example for some reason. And then you can suddenly put a number on that problem, not exactly, of course, but you can say, okay, a big proportion of people don't see this button, and I know I have this conversion problem, so that might quite well be related. And also you can have a look at your web analytics, and see when this number changes, you might have an idea already about why that is. Iterate, and that's obviously something that everyone says, so I just repeat it quite quickly. But then after it, the development goes on and goes on and goes on, and in the end you end up with a worse project for whatever reasons. So it's really important to iterate with the user testing as you iterate down the road. And that obviously also means to start really early. Don't wait until the beta is out. I think he's probably from Poland, but I'm not sure. A lot of times, actually far too often, people come to me and say, hey, we are rolling this build out next week. What's your usability view on that? That's way too late, because A, it will take me a couple of days to do a proper research on that, and then after that, there will likely be some recommendations about probably more fundamental stuff than people would like, and there's no way you can do that in a week, no way at all. So there are, as I said before, there are tools you can use as early on as from your first concept, your first wireframes, your first prototype, so do that. And another one is be creative about that. This is my favorite example from user research, probably. It's from the people who built the Uncharted game series. For those of you who are not familiar with the game series, I'll just quickly describe the problem. In that game, you jump and you climb a lot. So you jump somewhere, then you have hold, and then you climb. And the designers wanted to figure out where people struggle with that, where they think they can climb and they can't climb. And to find that out, obviously, if you do that in the traditional way, what you have to do is, in a 10-hour-long game, you have to watch hours and hours and hours of video, because if you want to do some quantitative analysis on that, you need dozens of participants, and a dozen times 10 hours, that's quite a bit of research. So they came up with this genius solution where they logged every time a player pressed the jump button and did not end up hanging somewhere. Then they built that into their level editors, and then they could really easily see, oh yeah, there's a high concentration of these kind of failed attempts, so there's something that we have to fix. So really one of the best pieces of user research I've seen. Okay, going into the last bit here, to present you with some challenges that you might face depending on the situation and what industry you're in. So the first one is that your business objectives might collide with your user objectives, obviously. And a nice example for that is Microsoft. Of course, it's nice for Microsoft when their console is always on, you gather data all the time, that's really powerful, really awesome. But as a user, you really might not want that. So what my recommendation would be is do proper research on your users. Not because I say the user objectives are always more important, but because you have to be able to put a number on that. You have to know the detrimental effect that you are having on your users when you override their objectives, basically, because then you can make an informed decision, and then you don't do a big press conference and announce something, and a week later you have to do a full stop and take it back, and Sony goes like this. If you're in e-commerce, chances are that you will have to have a slightly different approach. Alex is having a good time, cool. Your wife did that? Your comment? There's some research that suggests that if users come to an online e-commerce store and the website is too simple, they will assume that your product range is not as great. Which is quite interesting, because obviously if you make it too cluttered and too loaded, then your users will have a hard time finding what they want. So that's the main issue if you're in e-commerce, trying to figure out a way of how to display a lot of products without cluttering everything. And it's really, really important, and we find that throughout all our user testing, that users want the product. Don't give them aspirational text, don't tell them about like fashion lines and stuff. Every user tells me, okay, information, yeah, no, I want the price, yeah, I want the fabrics, don't show me all this text. If you're building professional software, so stuff that has to have a lot of functionality, then you have the specific issue of having to care about this learning curve. Because people have to be able to kind of get on with it without having to take a seminar first. But on the other hand, you want to put just as many functions as possible in there, as quickly to access as possible. There's no perfect solution to that. One idea is to have hidden accelerators, so shortcuts, for example, that people learn after a while, that increase their efficiency, but that don't necessarily stand in their way while learning it. But this is just something that if you do that, you have to put a lot of research effort into this exact piece. And to close with my favorite, obviously, games. With games, it's quite weird, because on the one hand, in usability, you always want to provide people with a nice experience. It should be easy, they shouldn't struggle, they shouldn't be frustrated. Yeah, but in games, you want all that at some times. You want it to be difficult. You want that's why people play games, at least for some reason. So it's really, really hard and really, really important to do research and figure out at what point our users experience some difficulties that annoy them, that diminish their sense of agency, stuff like that, and when they're just struggling, but they will continue 100 times and play the level again and again and again, because it's kind of a good challenge for them. Initially, I wanted to do some live user testing here on stage, but due to time reasons, my suggestion would be, if you have your product with you, your app, your website, whatever, just approach me outside. I'm here all day, and then we'll grab a participant and do some just grassroots user research, and you can get a hang of how you can do that. Whew. Okay, takeaways. You are wrong. It's extremely important. If you take away one thing, then you will always be wrong to some extent. You might not be really wrong, it might not matter that much, but you are wrong. And as long as you keep an eye on that, I guess you will probably make better decisions. Test your assumptions early. Clear thing, you want to prevent avalanche effects. Choose the right method. And you don't have to be scientific about it. Just think about what your users want, what the problems might be, and what would be the best way to find that out. And again, you can be creative, you can do your own thing. Just don't be like, yeah, okay, eye tracking is expensive and I get like nice pictures, so that must be good for everything, right? Triangulate. If you can, if you have the resources, do a couple of different things and not just one. Do a survey, ask people like in person, do click tracking, whatever. And iterate. Not only do it once, do it a couple of times, do it over and over again, do it as long as you're developing. And since we're going into like a service industry, don't stop once you have released it, but keep on it and on. And I think if you catch Winston's talk yesterday, he gave some really interesting insights on that. Okay, so I have 4 minutes left, and since we're a bit over time, I'll stop here. If you want to contact me if you have any questions, because I know a lot of that was very general. If you have specific questions on that, just let me know. You can add me at Twitter and then send me a PM or whatever, or just catch me outside. Any questions?